Hello, and welcome to the Questions and Answers edition of the Thriving Kids podcast at the Child Mind Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Anderson. In last week's episode, I spoke with Dr. Adam Zamora about how to help kids do well in school. We talked about how to keep kids motivated, how to establish a growth mindset in school, how you look at academic routines, how you engage the village in supporting kids' school success, and how to help kids who might not want to do their homework or might be looking toward big transitions like college. This week, I'll be answering your follow-up questions, the things that come up day to day when you're trying to support your child or teen's success in school. Let's get into it. And we're back with your questions. So, the great thing about the questions this week is that we have pretty much the most representative group of questions from our listeners that I think we've ever gotten of the concerns that we hear every day in office from parents about the concerns that they have about their kids in school. And you've asked it in the exact ways that parents would ask it. So, we've got a lot of good, authentic wording here. So, our first question: my daughter is a high school senior and she wants to do well, but her friends aren't motivated and don't want to do anything. How can I support her when she's surrounded by that energy? So we wanted to lead off with this question because we really like the phrasing of it. It's clearly a parent who doesn't feel their daughter's peer group is supporting their achievement at the level that maybe they would like the peer group to be invested in school or invested academically. So what I always say to parents is that what you want to start with is how your kid constructs their identity. So if you're going to ask them a question, you'd ask them what kind of goals they have for the year. You'd ask them maybe what kind of student they want to be. This is coming from a body of literature in psychology called motivational interviewing, where when we have teenagers who maybe we're finding are not as motivated for treatment or not as motivated academically, what we start off with is just a question of their own goals. And oftentimes in that discussion of their goals, we can find a way to work in how we can support them toward something we think is good for them or something that we think should be the objective maybe that they're focused on. So as you hear your daughter talk about wanting to do well in school, which it sounds like this question asker believes that their daughter is motivated, you can kind of draw these distinctions. You can say, and again, we're trying to get the kid to come to this conclusion. We're not trying to tell them that we've come to this conclusion. So we can say, like, what do you think would support you in doing well during this, senior year? What do you think could be maybe a distractor or something that might not support you in doing well? And what you hope is that the kid might come to maybe that their friends are a little bit less motivated. And so you can talk through how you stay motivated even when your friends aren't focused in school. And I'd expect that those conflicts would come along maybe in certain ways, like your friends are online at night, or they're snapping you, or they're kind of like asking you to chat, and they're not really focused on homework, but you're still focused on getting your homework done. Or maybe it's that you want to go home after school and get a project done, but your friends kind of want to hang out. And you can talk to a teen about how they manage peer pressure, the pressure from their friends, and then how they actually succeed in school. I think the other key piece is not making it one conversation, kind of saying to them, like, look, I know it's awkward. Maybe you don't want your parent involved in this, but let me be your accountability buddy on this, which means maybe I can help you think about your goals and in as non-judgmental a way as possible, not really thinking about grades or trying to put pressure on you. I can help you to kind of assess each week. Do you feel like you put in the time you wanted or you had the right balance of friend time and academic time? It's a tough road to navigate for any teen for sure. And so this road is best navigated with some open communication and trying to help a teen to arrive at what sorts of pressures they might be balancing. Our second question for this podcast Q&A episode is, what should I do when the school is set up in a way that just doesn't match how my kid learns or communicates? Nothing about it seems to work for them. And this is a common question we get in the kind of literature on neurodivergence and school setup, because school isn't necessarily built for neurodivergence. In fact, if we look across many schools today, if we're looking at elementary schools, we see a real focus on reading, writing, and math, particularly because schools kind of standardize test scores and funding can sometimes be linked to how well that school is seen as performing within the district, or certain types of funding might be linked to those performance assessments. And then there's similar kind of benchmarks in middle and high school that may not be great for every kid in terms of what the school is working the entire student body toward, and might not be creating perhaps an environment that allows teachers. And this is the thing I always want to go back to when we talk to any single educator. Most educators really want to create spaces that are supportive of neurodivergent youth. At the same time, they're trying to adapt their classroom to the needs of many different youth at one time. And so we can't expect that we're going to be able to adapt the learning environment to everyone's needs. So what I'm often going to with parents is they might have a list of all the different ways that their kid learns or communicates, or the best ways that their child might be able to learn new material in class or be able to, say, interact with material. And I try to kind of narrow that list down to like one or two asks of a teacher, saying to a teacher, we understand that you're navigating all these different things, because this is always how it comes across in kind of parent-teacher collaboration, is we want to validate the fact that parents are managing a ton of things at home, which means that oftentimes, teacher requests about how we're doing homework or how we're engaging in things. Parents will say, I'm getting 17 emails from the school. They want my kid to practice their instrument, read for 40 minutes a night, also do their homework, and they're only in third grade. How do I manage all this in the midst of other extracurriculars and the fact that they have siblings? We want this kind of empathy to go both ways, where educators realize parents are juggling a lot at home, and we want parents to realize educators are similarly, juggling a lot in school. For any of you who are looking for like humorous perspectives on that, I highly recommend Abbott Elementary as a series to understand that. But like when we're thinking about how educators, juggle these things, we can kind of come in with some level of validation. I know you're juggling 29 students in the class. I know my kid is just one. Here's what I know from their learning style and what's helpful for them. In fact, I was just looking at this situation with a parent of a patient of mine this morning, where the parent had really written a letter because she felt like her son had had a tough year in ninth grade last year, and ahead of 10th grade, really wanted to write a letter to all of his 10th grade teachers about how he learns. The issue was the letter included like 6 or 7 different things about how her child learns that no teacher was going to be able to check all those boxes. And so all we were focused on was narrowing that letter down to say 2 things that we could ask each teacher to maybe check in on with that child, and maybe collaborate across, the entire team, maybe with their advisor as a central force in helping to support this kid's learning. Again, we're trying to juggle tons of things in each of these environments and also be reasonable about what we ask for our kids, but it can't hurt to ask. Our next question: what can I do if my child is really disruptive in class? And how do I set boundaries that actually stick at school and at home? This is a great question because it relates to other podcast episodes we have. Our podcast episodes have themes centered around what we know to be the most important topics of 21st century parenting. So if you go back to the first ever episode of Thriving Kids with Dr. Caroline Mendel, clinical director for Brightline Clinical Services across New York City, we go through all kinds of different steps in intervention for kids with significant behavioral challenges. So that's a great episode to listen to, and there's a lot of associated resources we have in those show notes. But just to answer this question right now for the parent who sent this in this week, when kids are really disruptive in class, we have to look at what the literature says is effective for those kids at elementary, middle, and high school ages. And oftentimes for young ages, let's say elementary into early middle school, what matters the most is making sure that the adults in that child's environment are unified on interventions that work. Those interventions tend to be centered around a few principles. It's making sure that we have an achievable number of specific, defined, kind of positively phrased goals for the child, in the sense that we're only working on, say, 2 or 3 behaviors at any one time. What we're trying to build in is a system of things called a daily report card, where we have kind of a daily report in elementary school, and we still do the same thing as we go up into later grades. It's just that we'll have a number of teachers contributing that daily report card. But we will create a daily report card with, say, 2 or 3 targets assessed across each period of the school day, and trying to catch a kid being good as they're working on those particular targets. We don't want to burden educators with too much work. I've said this in other questions on this episode. A lot of times educators will say, well, look, I don't have time to necessarily create, something that's a daily check-in for every single kid. And what I'll often say is, we already know that we're speaking to this kid about their behavior multiple times a day. I don't necessarily want to push a teacher to speak to a kid more often, but instead to make those meetings a bit more efficient. We're kind of highlighting in any meeting with the kid whether or not we can catch them being good doing any of the targets on their daily report card. And if we can't catch them being good, if we can't give them credit for that behavior during this particular class period, maybe all we're doing is restating the goal and then giving them constructive feedback for the next class period. So systems like this, where we're giving a kid feedback at multiple points in the day and likely linking it to either in-school kind of reinforcing activities if the school has that available, or linking it to reinforcing activities at home that can be part of a parent-teacher collaboration. These can be highly effective interventions individually for kids with significant behavioral challenges at school. Now, importantly, for all of those of you listening, these interventions are just the first step. We want to make sure that we have a process to reinforce a kid's progress on specifically defined target goals. We want to make sure that we have a way of collecting data on a child's progress. So frequently when we do these kinds of consultations in school, we will ask to collect some baseline data on the child's disruptive behavior during school, then look at the effect of this intervention so that we can know it's working. The difficulty that we have if we don't collect data on interventions like this is that parents and teachers will sometimes say, well, last week, this child had a huge temper tantrum at this time of the day, or there was a moment where they melted down at the end of school, and we'll kind of summarize the kid's behavior based on the most emotionally valenced moment, the most emotionally intense moment, and it's not really a clear picture of their overall level of improvement. They might have improved on 4 out of 5 school days that past week, but there's that one moment that sticks in our brains and we say that was the crisis of the week. Until that stops happening, I can't really trust this improvement, which we understand. But we want to take a more data-driven approach that takes a look at how the kid is doing on any given day and utilizes these kinds of plans because these plans work for every human. When we're doing improvement plans in the workplace, when we're doing couples work, when we're doing work with people in large groups, we will still say the principles of behavior change remain the same. Specifically define a few target behaviors, not more than 2 or 3, because nobody can hold more than that in mind. Let's try to catch people making progress on those particular behaviors. And then at the same time, we do want to set up consequences when things might become unsafe or particularly disruptive. So frequently in schools, what we'll try to define is 3 zones around a plan for a kid with significant behavioral challenges, where we'll say, what are the moments where we catch the kid being good? The second zone is, what are the moments that we can perhaps give that child some sort of redirection, try to pivot them to another task, maybe give attention to a peer near them. This is a strategy called differential reinforcement for something that we like that peer is doing and hope the child follows suit. There are a number of strategies in there, but we might be trying to consciously not give too much attention to a particular behavior that a child is doing if it's not all that disruptive. And then there's this third zone where it really does get into major disruption or major aggression or a lack of safety, where we're going to need to have consequences either in school, which could result in the child being removed from the classroom or needing to have a detention or perhaps missing a preferred activity, or consequences that we might work on setting up at home in sort of a parent-teacher collaboration where we'd say if these things occur in school, this is going to be the loss of a privilege that happens when the child gets home after that school day. Again, a lot of this is outlined in more detail in our first Thriving Kids podcast episode and in show notes that we have around managing behavior here in the Thriving Kids show notes and in notes that we have on our website, childmind.org. Going to our next question. My child has drop-off anxiety, even after being in school for a while. Noisy classrooms seem to make it worse. How can I help them settle in? So this question has 2 main, kind of aspects to it. One is that a parent is asking about separation anxiety, likely for a young kid in school, and the other is that the parent's bringing in kids who have sometimes sensory sensitivities or things that might make their own coping with difficult situations a little bit worse. So, to address the first part of that question, when a child has drop off anxiety, it can be really hard for parents to realize that letting the kid be uncomfortable is actually fine. Your child does not need to be comfortable when you leave. And in fact, that's one of the ways that we sort of support kids with anxiety that is less effective in helping kids to be able to cope with anxiety. And we talk about this a lot, with kind of the optimum levels of stress for youth. We want kids to be challenged to a certain degree. Now, I'll often use a rating scale with parents where I'll say, if a kid is anxious at kind of like an 8 or above on a scale of 1 to 10, that might mean that the emotion is so disorganizing that they really can't cope. They're not really able to kind of address the situation or kind of move forward. And that might just be too distressing. And we don't necessarily want to put them in that zone too much. That might be what we call flooding in the anxiety world. But if they're between, say, a 4 to a 7, that's a good level of uncomfortable. That's a good level of challenge. We're okay with kids being that uncomfortable because what we know is that in that zone, as much as they are uncomfortable, part of dealing with anxiety is realizing that anxiety is a false alarm bell, that we don't necessarily need to be anxious in this particular situation. We're leaving our child with a safe adult who can keep them safe and is going to help them to learn or do fun activities in school or take care of them in just the way that their parents or other caregivers might. And so our messaging to a kid is, not so much that they need to be calm when we leave, but instead we'll set up with a parent. We'll say, look, you're going to be uncomfortable when you leave. They're going to be uncomfortable when you leave. It's okay to leave them when they're still in tears. It's okay to leave them when they're still anxious. That anxiety is serving a function. It's what keeps you pulled in that situation, but it's also not helping them to confront the completely typical developmental challenges that they're going through. So what we'll say to parents is, let's set up a ritual. You'll talk beforehand with your child. How many hugs are we going to do within reason? If a kid asks for 8 hugs, maybe that's the upper limit. But if we're talking about like 40 hugs, probably not. But maybe we'll do a hug. Maybe we'll remember for ourselves a coping thought like mama is dropping you with someone who is just as nice as your parents are, or daddy is dropping you off with people who are safe and care about you a lot, whatever that might be. And then what you're doing is leaving them in the classroom and walking away. And knowing that they can be uncomfortable, they can get through this challenge, and it's actually good for them because too much accommodation of anxiety actually doesn't allow kids to develop the coping skills they need for totally typical developmental challenges. Now, getting to the second part of the question, when we see that a kid really gets, kind of disorganized or emotionally distraught when there is difficulty with, say, environmental stimuli or noise or other things that might be distracting, that can be a moment where we might want to think together with the teacher about how we do drop off without maybe those factors. And we work up to factors where we might drop off a kid when the class is kind of noisy. I mean, our 6-year-old daughter, she had a lot of drop off anxiety in preschool. And it was very true that if we dropped her off while preschool was still having breakfast at tables, kind of quiet, while every kid was eating a bowl of Cheerios, it got a lot easier to do the drop off. But if we were a little bit late and they were already transitioning to like outside time in the yard, that got a lot more difficult because it was just a lot more activity and it felt a lot less settled in terms of her ability to settle into the classroom. So we shot for being early, at least in the moments when we were working on that separation anxiety. But we also realized even if we had to leave our daughter in a state of a little bit more distress, when we see her at the end of the day, we remember that it stayed with us a lot more than it stayed with her. She looked happy, and meanwhile, we're walking in there with tense looks on our faces, my wife and me, hoping that she didn't feel like she was abandoned or abandoned with her anxiety, and realizing we were actually the ones who were more nervous or the ones who had stayed with more, just due to our overdeveloped, memory and her ability to kind of forget things and play with her friends. Okay, our next question for this episode. How do we help kids balance school with all the other activities they're involved in without getting stressed or burned out? This is a question we get a lot. So, first, I get asked, what is the minimum number of activities that a kid should be in? And the answer is at least one. When we look at the things that are necessary for a kid's development, we want parents to outline to kids why they're doing activities. So when they're doing activities and they're balancing kind of their extracurricular schedule, we want them to be, investigating new things. We want them to be looking at new hobbies. We want them to be trying out new things that could become their passions or things they would try, whether that's across music or art or sports or any number of things, coding, computer science. We want them to be looking at all kinds of things that could become hobbies outside school. And if you've got a kid who's not very much into activities, we're just kind of espousing the values of these activities. This is exploring your hobbies. This is being able to be in situations with other kids without, the kind of rules and the structure of school. We want you to have exposure to that. And the minimum is that you got to pick at least one activity that you're doing. Either in school, you're joining a club or doing something like that, or out of school, we're trying to get you involved in activity with your peers or something that you might explore. Now, we get to the other side of these questions, which is there a maximum number of activities? And in most cases, we're looking at the individual child, and we're not thinking there's necessarily a one size fits all approach. Um, when I talk to parents about this, we'll often go through a developmental checklist where I'll say, let's go through the main things that are drivers of your child's healthy development. Is your child sleeping well? Are they eating regularly? Are they hydrating? Are they moving their body? Start with those. Those are basic wellness habits. Are they doing okay in school? Do they have enough time to finish their homework? Do they have enough time to actually take the space to work on their homework? Then the next question is every child needs downtime. They need to be bored. They need to be thinking on their own, kind of, what do I amuse myself with in this moment? They need to have some quiet time. So, do we have that somewhere in their lives? The next thing is, do they have free form time with their friends? Elementary, middle, and high school ages, we need in person time that isn't necessarily structured just to hang with peers and develop those in person, face to face peer skills. From there, we get to their activities, their extracurriculars. We know they need at least one where they're interacting with peers, they're developing a passion. And then beyond that, we're looking at, is the child happy with these things? Are they excited to go to these activities? Do they complain that they're tired? Do they complain that, they're feeling run down or they're feeling exhausted? Do they complain that it's too much? And frequently, when we see kids who have too many things in the schedule, maybe they're trying to play two sports and learn an instrument, and they're going to religious or cultural school, I'll oftentimes go to parents and say, look, what are non negotiables for you? And the parents might say, well, look, we're not cutting out this because this is really important to our family. And I'll say, okay, but let's still experiment across any given season with cutting out a couple of other things and seeing if it makes it so your child feels happier, more fulfilled, more excited about what they might be doing. And looking at what the child reports about their overall well being. And we're trying to find that formula for any given child. I can't tell you the number of families I speak with where siblings are so different on this, where parents will say, I don't understand. Her sister wanted to do every single activity, and yet her younger sister just wants to have downtime, explore art and paint, and have like one thing that she's involved with friends. Is this okay? And the answer is to each their own. And as long as we're looking back at that developmental checklist, making sure this child has supportive adults in their life, face to face friends they can interact with, at least one extracurricular, feeling like they're, investing in school, those check boxes define whether or not a kid is, really developing in a way that is healthy for them. It's not the number of extracurriculars. Our next question: how can we help kids stay focused when the topic doesn't interest them at all? So, when we're looking at this in school and we're talking about kind of interest for kids, I'll often talk to kids about how there are three zones of focus. And what that means is that there's the zone of things that you are really interested in and you think are cool. Maybe this is K pop Demon Hunters, which my kids are currently obsessed with. And I'll kind of give that example and say, like, this is something where if anybody wanted to talk about it, if anyone wants to talk about what their favorite songs are, whether or not like soda pop is better than golden, that kind of stuff, like, we're invested. Then there's a zone of faking it till you make it, which is basically we know these things are important to focus on, but we have to learn as individuals over time, and kids have to kind of train themselves on this to bring their focus to topics that they might not find that interesting, but they can actually look at their environment and say, but this is important. My teacher is trying to teach me an important skill. And even though math isn't all that interesting to me, I know I've got to learn multiplication. Or even though this book wasn't that interesting to me, I know that the strategies I'm using for analyzing literature in high school might, play into how I analyze written text in my career in the future. And that is a tough kind of like analysis point. The third zone is stuff that either doesn't matter or is not interesting or both, where maybe we can get ourselves a little bit unfocused and, daydream a bit. But when we're talking about that kind of middle zone, for kids who have difficulties with attention or for kids who have a lot of difficulties, staying focused on things they're not interested in, we want to name what this issue is. Tell them, like, there are these things in life where we want you to develop that skill to be able to look around and say, as much as I'm not interested in this, the principal is talking, or this is an important subject, or this is an important topic. And so I'm going to try to bring my focus to this. And the best way we can help kids with this is also to give them active engagement techniques. So we can say, look, what I want you to do is think about as the teacher is talking, write down one thing on your paper, just one thing every couple of minutes, whatever the teacher's saying, even if you don't think it's the most interesting detail, or if you don't think it's the best representation of what you're talking about, it might help you to stay engaged with the discussion. Or I'll say to kids, if you find that you stay engaged if you're participating, let's write a couple, little boxes at the top of a sheet while you're in class. And maybe you've got three boxes. And what you're reminded to do is across a 45-minute class period, You check off one box every time you raise your hand and contribute something to the discussion. And that helps you to stay a little bit locked in and following the flow of the discussion because you know that you're putting it on yourself to participate at least 3 times and throw something out there. So, whatever it is, how we can get them kind of actively thinking about engaging with what's at hand, that way we can keep them a little bit more focused on following the flow of the conversation or following what the teacher's saying or following what their friends are saying, even if they're not that interested in discussing The Scarlet Letter or Lord of the Flies, or I'm just naming books I wasn't that interested in high school. How do I get my kid to take responsibility for their school stuff, remembering homework, packing their bag, getting out the door on time without nagging constantly? This is a great question about organizational skills. So, when we think about how you develop organizational skills, and frequently when we look at the organizational skills that are being asked about in this question, we think of the beginnings of independence as starting around late elementary school. So, early elementary school, we expect that kids remembering the homework is going to come from adult caregivers in their lives, their teachers reminding them about doing these things. We expect that packing their bag and getting out the door on time is going to come from adults structuring this. And so, if you think about those early elementary school years, you want to model for your child how you'd like them to handle it in later years. So we'll tell adults, if we want 3 ingredients on, managing school stuff in the early years, show your kids how you can stay mildly regulated in the morning. Show your kids how you go through a kind of predictable checklist that makes it so that they know what to expect and what needs to be remembered in certain situations. And as much as you can, make that checklist visual so that they can participate in the process as well to whatever developmental level is appropriate for them. And then finally, really highlight the situations where you're successful in organizational stuff and also highlight with kind of a bit of grace the moments where you're unsuccessful. Like, for example, if you forget your kid's lunch or forget to pack your kid's lunch one day, or you guys get out really late for school, the more we can show kids that those mistakes happen and then that we can go back and look at it as kind of like a situational thing that we can address together, maybe come up with new strategies for, the more likely you are to see them address those situations in the future as problem solvers instead of looking for who to blame. So, for example, recently we were out the door for school a little bit late, and school for my kids started about a week and a half ago, so we've only had a few trials. But my son gets really, really nervous whenever he's late to things. And so he's sitting there as we're walking to the bus stop talking about how my daughter made us really late because she was spending too much time getting her hair into a ponytail, and he was really mad about this, and he's looking to, cast aspersions and assign blame. And what I tried to pivot the conversation to was it sounds like you're saying that part of our morning ritual might be making time for brushing teeth or doing hair or whatever else it might be. And I jokingly referenced the fact that my son likes to brush his hair down because he doesn't like it to be too spiky and looking like he's in a 90s boy band. So what we talked about instead was pivoting to what could we do tomorrow morning to make a little bit more space. And both kids arrive at, we're going to wake up 5 minutes earlier, and that's going to help us get out the door on time. And that's the way I'm trying to structure the approach to situations for a 9-year-old and 6-year-old who are, at least for one of them on the upper end, getting to a point where they maybe can take a little bit more independent management of these skills. And as we get up in years, we expect by late elementary school, we can start giving kids a little bit more independence around this. Maybe we have a list on the fridge and we can start saying to a 9 or a 10-year-old, hey, look at the list on the fridge. It's got, visuals that remind you what you need to pack or what needs to happen in the morning. Why don't you help me get through these kinds of things this morning? And then as we get into middle school or high school, I'll tell parents what you want to think about for the lists and kind of this organization is first, visual and written cues are so much better than oral working memory. Most teens do not remember more than one thing that a parent gives them a direction to do. And this is an endless source of frustration for parents and teens. So write it down. And whether it involves sending a high schooler a text in the morning with the things they've got to remember, or whether it involves giving a middle schooler an index card each morning on this, the principles are make it visual, make it written. Uh, Catch the kid actually being successful organizationally and tell them how proud you are when they're able to kind of manage these skills independently. And lastly, don't get scenery blind. And this is a big principle where I'll kind of, you know, uh, show kids this by asking them to like kind of name like art in my office or art that's on display in their house, where really they've walked past something hundreds of times but cannot remember what that picture is on the wall because it's become scenery in their life. And I'll say to kids, if you put a Post-it note on the mirror or you have, one list on the fridge, over time, that list just becomes scenery. We want to think about new and different ways to remind ourselves of the things we need to do in ways that catch our attention or in new spots or new colors so that those routines don't become tired for us. All right, we've got two more questions left in this episode. So, our second and last question. What should I do if my kid says they hate school every single day? How can I advocate for my child when they come home upset about something at school like bullying or a problem with a teacher? I never know when to step in or how. This is another two-part question. So the first part, what should I do if my kid says they hate school every single day? I was interpreting that question not as something like bullying or a teacher who they're really not getting along with was occurring, but just more like a kid who just isn't interested in school or doesn't find academic subjects to be that engaging for them. And I'll just say the general approach for that is I will try to maybe look at things with a little bit more of a narrow lens with a kid or a teen. So I'll say, look, I know that globally it feels like everything at school sucks. It feels like you hate everything. You don't like your friends. You don't like the teachers. You don't like the subjects. But things are rarely as global as they feel. That tends to be a label that we get into as maybe a thinking trap. So, can we take a look, just a close eye, at all of your teachers? Is there one teacher you feel like is in your corner or that you'd like to learn from? Or any adult, any person at school that you feel like is supportive of you and that maybe could help you and support you in school or in terms of what you're doing? Is there one club at school? Is there one teacher who runs an activity that maybe you could get excited about? Is there one peer that you feel like laughs at some of your comments or notices when you make a comment to a friend or something like that, or when you're, talking to friends who seems interested in what you have to say? Can we focus on interacting with that peer a little bit more often? And frequently, what I'm trying to do is define a plan with a kid where they're going to focus on those couple little footholds that they might have that can help them get through the school day. And maybe make it so that they can go from, say, island to island of things that they at least find tolerable or might find a little bit enjoyable, even as they're trying to weather the stuff that they find boring or, uh, you know, really kind of grating on their ability to just kind of stay invested in what's going on during a school day. There are also some kids who just don't have answers to that. And in that case, a lot of times what I'm working with them on is distress tolerance, saying, look, school may not, at least for this year or, this particular friend group or whomever you're in classes with, be all that amazing in this particular time period. So how can I help you outside of school to fill your cup and perhaps decrease your stress so that you can get through a stressful experience that I know I can help you handle? And that tends to be a really empowering question when we can kind of identify what we can't change and then identify maybe where we can work on certain things and tweak certain things that can help a kid to just get through. Our last question for our Q&A for this particular Thriving Kids podcast. How do I talk to my child about grades without putting too much pressure on them? It is very difficult to talk to kids about grades really past the elementary school years without kids assuming that you want them to improve something or you have a certain like level of academic performance in your mind that you'd like them to actually perform at. These are difficult conversations. And what I'm trying to do oftentimes when I talk to kids about grades is not start off with like what letter grade or what particular average they or their parents feel they need to be at, but instead trying to talk to the kid about their effort. And this is what is kind of the underlying force behind grades. Do we feel like we're putting in our effort as much as we can in each of our classes? Do we feel like there are things that we could improve that might improve our performance in classes? Study more comprehensively for tests, start studying a little bit earlier, have different ways of supporting our writing process so that we're not writing papers the night before. If we can focus on the processes that support good academic performance rather than the products, the grades themselves, those conversations can often be less threatening to kids or teens because we seem like we're problem solving for them the things that they're going through and the kind of problems they can solve. And we're not just getting mad about, for example, a factor that may not be able to be changed until, say, the mid-year or the end-of-year report, and where they just feel like they're kind of under a dark cloud until they can show you some evidence of change. The more we can focus on the processes and less on the products, the better. And that is the thought that I will leave you with in this Q&A episode. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you for listening to this Q&A episode of Thriving Kids, our podcast from the Child Mind Institute. I hope these answers gave you some helpful ways to think about supporting your child at school and maybe made things feel a little bit more manageable. If you missed last week's episode with Dr. Zamora, I recommend giving it a listen. We talk about growth mindset, we talk about academic routines, we talk about procrastination and not wanting to do homework, and we talk about when to worry about a kid's learning and when to seek some outside help. We'd also love to answer any of your questions in a future Q&A episode, so please send your questions our way, comment on our social media posts with your questions, and you can email us at podcast@childmind.org. Again, that's podcast@childmind.org. See you next time.